Each Van der Linde gang member has a very interesting story of their life before the gang. I will cover the origin story of each member and how they joined the gang specifically. 95% of my viewers are unsubscribed, so if you'd like to see more content like this, please subscribe. Simon Pearson. Pearson was a son of a family of whale hunters and wanted to become one himself before the industry dried up by the time he became an adult. Instead, he became a Navy sailor to satisfy his dreams of sailing the high seas, and it seems like he really loved the time he was as a sailor, often reminiscing on the times there, telling Arthur and a lot of other people in the gang just any time he can about the time he was in like the Philippines or just some time he was in the Navy, because it seems like he really, really loved the time of sailing. And after leaving the Navy, he got into a lot of financial trouble, likely after spending all of his money in some stupid way, likely gambling or something else like that. But loan sharks eventually came after him, and during this time, he met Dutch and the gang, and they saved him, resulting in him becoming the cook and butcher for the gang, and just overall a really, really outstanding member of the gang in general. Charles Smith. Charles was born to a black father and a Native American mother, and Charles and his father lived with his mother's tribe before the U.S. Army drove them away from their homeland, and his mother was eventually captured by U.S. Army soldiers and then never seen again by Charles, which, really sucks for him. But after this, his father fell into a deep depression, leading him down the road of alcoholism, which led to Charles eventually leaving his father and wandering the Wild West by himself. After joining many different gangs and just surviving on his own for a while, Charles finally joined the Van der Linde gang, as he felt that Dutch and the gang were some of the only people that would treat him right due to his heritage of being a mixed person and also being a black and Native American person, which is a pretty uncommon thing during this time. Mary Beth. Not much is known about Mary Beth's early life, but when she was young, Mary Beth became an advanced thief and would steal watches and wallets from wealthy men in local towns, and it seemed like that's kind of how she got by. Likely she was an orphan before, or kind of left her family, but it's not really known about those details. But eventually these men realized that Mary Beth was stealing their stuff and tried to get their stuff back. But during this time, I guess there's some kind of scuffle, and somehow the Van der Linde gang ended up protecting Mary Beth and helping her get away from all these men that are trying to chase after her, and then she joined the gang like that. Uncle was born in Ohio at some point, but he actually had an uncle himself named Jeb, who Uncle says touched on him and did some weird things, and definitely was that classic uncle guy who's touching on you in some weird way. And Uncle was eventually 9 years old when he became an orphan and was forced to move to a new city and live on his wits from there on out. And it says he was also married a couple times before 1899, so maybe he was Red Harlow this whole time. But before the gang, Uncle claims to have been to Africa, where he was supposedly worshipped as a god in the Congo after selling camping supplies to them. He's also known as the one-shot kid, and supposedly was an insane gunslinger in his youth. But all these stories could just be Uncle boasting or lying, just kind of his classic just making up bullshit. But Uncle eventually joined the gang in 1894 and basically just leached off of their resources, making me think that the way he got into the gang was either saving someone's life or doing something really important, because it seems like a lot of the members that don't really do much did something really important, and that's why they're still in the gang to this day. Tilly Jackson. When Tilly was just 12 years old, she became an outlaw running with the Foreman brothers gang after they kidnapped her from her mother. But she eventually killed Anthony Foreman's cousin after he tried to make some moves on her and then wouldn't respond to her saying no. So then he kind of forced himself on her, and then she, self-defensed him and, slit him up and then ran away from the gang. Eventually, she tried to find her mother, but her mother had passed away during her absence of running with the Foreman's brothers gang, and Tilly eventually joined the Van der Linde gang after Dutch found her when she was in trouble with the law and took her into the gang and raised her just like he did with John and Arthur. Tilly eventually viewed Dutch as a father figure, similar to how Arthur and John viewed him, because she kind of had the same way where she was kind of raised by Dutch in a sense. And this is likely why she kind of stayed so long with the gang while all of her friends had left, like Karen and Mary Beth, and everyone else had left, until he was still sticking with Dutch basically the entire time throughout the entire game. Reverend Swanson. Before joining the gang, Swanson was also a reverend, but instead of being a man of faith, he was doing some very sinful things, like becoming an alcoholic and just cheating on his wife with a bunch of different married women. And he actually lost his faith during these moments, and then eventually left his wife for another married woman named Margaret. The law eventually followed them after they tried to marry each other while also being married and not getting a divorce from their spouses. And Margaret eventually left Swanson to go on a ship to Shanghai. Swanson joined the Vanderlyn gang after saving Dutch's life somehow, which resulted in Dutch being in his debt and providing for Swanson even when he kind of continued to indulge in all of Earth's pleasures with like the opium and just being a total like addict for a while until he eventually cleaned his act up during the end of the game. Josiah Trani. Trelawney was born in England but eventually moved to the United States where he became a con man, and during this time he joined the Vanderlyn gang either by being on the run from the law or being part of some robbery that like kind of got him into the gang and then eventually full on joining. But I think it was a little bit of like Dutch's protective side where this is a guy who wasn't going to really work outside of the gang. I mean, he can do stuff outside of the gang, but like he's always going to get in trouble in his own way. So he said, oh, come join the gang and we'll kind of help you out a little bit. But during the time of joining the gang, he did have a family in Saint Denis that he hid from the gang and would often leave both the gang and his family for long periods of time and just kind of tried to hide each of them away from the other one. And I'm assuming that Trelawney likely joined the gang 1895 or before because it seems like they know him well enough to at least have been partners for multiple years and know that he's going to be gone for long periods of time. So at least I think they have known him for like 4 or 5 years by the time of the actual game. Kieran Jones. Kieran Jones joined the gang after being a scam artist in her own right, and it seems like she kind of did the same thing as Mary Beth, where she would steal men's wallets and watches and kind of take them and pawn them off that way. And it seems like she was also an orphan in the same right, but she just loved the outlaw lifestyle and was drawn to conning people. And there's no actual like proof of the way she joined, but I'm assuming it's pretty similar to Mary Beth, where she either got in trouble with the law or got in trouble with some like powerful people, and Dutch was like, we can help you and you can provide at least a little bit for us, so you got to join the gang. Susan Grimshaw. Grimshaw started the gang in a way, being the first member of the gang besides Hosea and Dutch after Dutch fell in love with her and kind of invited her to join the gang, but she wasn't like really a member. She was more of just like Dutch's lover, but she eventually like became a full member of the gang. They eventually fell in love while Dutch would play poker, and then Grimshaw would just sit in his lap. And even after Dutch became romantically involved with Annabelle, Grimshaw stayed in the gang because she liked the lifestyle that they could provide, and she didn't really want to leave the people that she had formed close bonds with, like Arthur, John, and Hosea, and kind of wanted to like provide and like always stay with them because they were kind of part of her family in a way. So she didn't want to leave them even after like her and Dutch had kind of fallen out of love. John Marston. John's father was a Scottish immigrant who died when John was just 8 years old after getting blinded in a bar fight. It's not necessarily clear if he died in the actual bar fight or if he died after the bar fight, but he did die around this period no matter what. This left John an orphan as his mother had died during John's birth. And John moved from orphanage to orphanage until he was 12 years old when he was caught stealing by some farmers in Illinois who wanted to hang him before Dutch stepped in and saved him. John eventually would become a member of the Vanderlyn gang, with Dutch and Hosea becoming his surrogate fathers and Arthur kind of becoming his surrogate brother. And Dutch and Hosea taught John to read, fight, and hunt, and taught him many different things like Evelyn Miller's teachings, which led to John and Arthur, having this dependence on Dutch as their father figure. And not as much on Hosea because Dutch really instilled in this philosophy that, both Arthur and John followed, but, Hosea was also a father figure to both of them as well. Abigail Marston. Abigail was also an orphan just like John was and became a member of the Vanderlyn gang after Uncle introduced her to the gang just after she turned 18. The gang quickly took a liking to her and many gang members slept with her before she finally fell in love with John Marston, resulting in her pregnancy with their child, Jack Marston. Jack Marston joined the gang right out of the womb as Abigail birthed him in 1895, and he became kind of a member of the gang instantly. I mean, he wasn't doing anything for the gang, but everyone was providing for him, and he's just taking the free handouts because he was like a baby. But despite many of the gang members having relationships with Abigail during their time there, she claimed Jack to be John's child, resulting in John actually leaving the gang for a year, but the gang immediately became family to Jack as they would take care of him when Abigail was occupied. They would try and shield him from all the horrible actions that would the gang would commit during their travels, and just try to keep him like as sheltered of a child as someone that's like a member of a very large and very famous gang could be. Molly O'Shea. Molly O'Shea was born to a rich family from Dublin, Ireland, and came to America searching for a change of pace from the very simple life of living as a rich woman in Ireland. Eventually she met Dutch and fell in love with him, and they became lovers, and Molly joined the gang as his live-in girlfriend, kind of like Annabelle and Grimshaw had already done once before in the gang. Lenny Summers. Lenny grew up as the son of an escaped slave mother and a father who would then take care of him after his mother's death. Lenny's father taught him how to read and write and gave him a pocket watch, which Lenny eventually lost in the confusion at the Blackwater Massacre, but Lenny's father was eventually beaten to death by drunken men in a bar fight, and Lenny eventually killed them as an act of revenge and went on the run, eventually joining the Vanderlyn gang after meeting them in the Grizzlies in 1898, and just keeping up that cycle of Dutch saving these people that are supposedly in trouble from the law or in trouble from these powerful people coming after them. Dutch just has such a savior complex. Sadi Adler. When Sadie was young, she learned to hunt animals and ride horses, which allowed her to live away from a major town when she eventually got married to Jake Adler in 1896, and they would share the work evenly between the two of them, and sometimes would work with the protagonist from Red Dead Online. In 1899, Sadie's house was taken over by the O'Driscoll boys, with Jake being shot and passing away during the confrontation. Sadie eventually hid away in the cellar to not die as well until Dutch, Arthur, and Micah fought the O'Driscolls and found Sadie hiding away. Her confrontation with Micah eventually led to her house being burned down, and then she joined the gang after that, because again, there's kind of a similar savior complex from Dutch where you can't leave anyone who's in a struggling position. He can't turn them away, so he, lets her join the gang, and it was the best place for her because her husband had just died. She needed someone to kind of provide for her while she grieved for her husband's death. Dutch Vanderlyn. Since his youth, Dutch had read the works of Evelyn Miller and wanted to live a life with no constraints from the real world. Dutch quickly became an anarchist and resorted to a life of crime. In 1875, Dutch met Hosea Matthews, a con artist who tried to rob him, before realizing that Dutch had kind of already stolen from him. Realizing that they held similar views and skills, they started their own gang, the Vanderlyn Gang. And on one of their first missions together, they tricked locals into buying $300 worth of shares of fake shipping company, and they were quickly arrested but found a way out of the jail and robbed the sheriff on the way out. Javier Escuela. Javier grew up on land owned by Colonel Allende's ancestors, the antagonists of Red Dead Redemption 1, and had a father that was a drunkard, and his uncle and his friends eventually demanded a fair wage from the owners of the land from Allende's ancestors, and were eventually fed to the pigs right in front of Javier as a result. Because of this moment, Javier kind of just became disillusioned with society as a whole and became a bounty hunter with ideals similar to Dutch, using violence to kind of try and break apart the system that he lived under. And eventually he unalived a very powerful man in Mexico after they fought over a woman, and fled to America thinking his family may suffer if he stayed. He eventually did starve though, because he didn't speak any English, so he tried to steal some chickens and found Dutch. Dutch eventually fed Javier and offered him a spot in the gang because of their similar ideals, and Javier eventually became to idolize Dutch because of those ideals, and again, that's kind of why he picked Dutch's side in the end of the game. Bill Williamson. Bill was first born Marion Williamson in 1866, and embarrassed by this kind of girl's first name, which was supposedly a family name, he took Bill from his last name Williamson, and Bill is short for Will or William, so he took Bill from there. And Bill's father was an alcoholic who kind of just lost his mind because he drank so much and would just mix a bunch of different alcohols together and just would be drunk all the time. So, Bill eventually didn't want to become an alcoholic himself, so he kind of was doing a lot of other things, and he became kind of like not like an outlaw, but he's doing some weird stuff in his early life and was a delinquent. So he got thrown into reform school, and he continued to do criminal stuff throughout his entire early life. So he joined the army instead and fought against Native Americans, but was eventually discharged for deviancy, which is sleeping with another man, and attempted murder. I don't know what the attempted murder was. Maybe he tried to murder the guy that he was sleeping with, or the person who found them, or whatever, or someone resisted his charm or whatever. I don't know, but he became an outlaw after this and robbed people on the roads. And in 1893, he tried to rob Dutch, but Dutch laughed at him because, it's Bill trying to rob you, and Dutch is this crazy cool guy. And Bill kind of got mad at this, but Dutch was like, he kind of charmed his way out of it, and he eventually offered Bill a spot in the Van der Linde gang. Micah Bell. Micah was born to an outlaw father, also named Micah Bell, and quickly followed in his father's footsteps, running with both his father and his brother Amos at one point in their own outlaw gang. In 1898, Dutch met Micah in a town called Crenshaw Hills in the Grizzlies. This town isn't included in the gang, but would likely be north or west of Ambarino in gang, which a lot of people, theorize that's where the North Grizzlies would be. But Dutch was trying to sell the gang's gold before the deal went down, and in the commotion, Micah saved Dutch somehow. A lot of people speculate that Micah had always been looking for a gang or a way into the Van der Linde gang because they were a pretty famous gang at this point, and kind of thought this was the easiest way he could get in because Dutch was known for saving people in commotion or rewarding people that did save his own life. And since he did save Dutch's life, Micah was let into the gang, but he wasn't really liked by any of the other members except for Dutch, who respected him for his ideas and skills in combat, while everyone else hated him for being very hot-headed and just a pain in the ass to be around. Shawn Maguire. Shawn spent his early days in his native Ireland before moving to America with his outlaw father. His father was eventually hunted down and killed, and Shawn became an orphan. Shawn eventually became an outlaw of his own and met Hosea and Dutch in North Elizabeth at a bar. He tried to steal a pocket watch from Dutch and threatened them at gunpoint before they laughed at him, daring him to shoot at them. They'd already seen Shawn beforehand, and realizing that he was trying to steal from them, they'd taken the bullets out of his gun and then asked him to join the gang because they really liked his attitude. But it's pretty similar to Bill's story where, he tried to rob them and Dutch let him into the gang because he kind of liked who Bill was. And also Hosea's story, which is just really interesting how similar three of these stories are. I don't know if that's just Rockstar getting lazy on us, or it's just this would be a common occurrence in this time, but I don't know, it's kind of an interesting detail nonetheless. Kieran Duffy. Kieran's parents died when he was very young, and Kieran quickly started working as a stable boy before being thrown out. I don't really know what the reason is for that, but he eventually tried to join the army before quickly being thrown out of there as well. He then became an outlaw, but the gang he joined would eventually all be killed in front of him, and eventually he met the O'Driscolls, and they forced him to become a stable boy for them, and they said, join the gang or you're gonna die. So, he kind of had to join the gang. But after working for them for just a couple of months after the Van der Linde gang on the O'Driscoll base, Kieran was caught by Arthur and forced to be a hostage of the gang, eventually saving Arthur's life and becoming a full-fledged member of the gang. Leopold Strauss. When Strauss was a young boy, he got involved with the criminal lifestyle by helping his older brother, who would beat up night watchmen for food. Strauss's dad eventually sold his daughter into bonded labor, which kind of disillusioned Strauss with his family, resulting him in being shipped away to the United States by his father to live with his uncle. His uncle eventually soon died after there was a riot in New York, and he just could not see New York in a weird way. It was a war-torn New York, so he just died of a heart attack that way. But that resulted in Strauss eventually being left in America to fend for himself. But Strauss became a con man after this because he had nothing really else in his brain, and he didn't really know what else to do. And eventually he found Dutch in a way. I don't know exactly what happened, but maybe he was trying to scam Dutch, or maybe he scammed someone else that Dutch knew, and Dutch eventually allowed Strauss into the gang, where he became an accountant for the gang. And he eventually picked up loan sharking as well, as he saw it as a really easy way to make money, and he didn't really have to do anything, and it was probably one of the most profitable methods for the entire gang, and they didn't have to do anything that illegal. So it was a pretty solid profitable venture for them, but it eventually did result in the downfall of the entire gang, so maybe it wasn't the greatest idea. Hosea Matthews. Hosea was raised in the mountains, likely somewhere like Ambarino during his early childhood. His father was supposedly a very sinful man who Hosea had only met 3 times in his life, yet he still had a lot of respect for his father. Hosea tried to become a stage actor and comedian, but eventually left that life after he had little success, and he went full-time as an outlaw instead. Kind of a crazy career path switch from I'm trying to be a comedian or an actor, and instead you become an outlaw. But While stealing and robbing, Hosea was caught trying to take a chicken, and a sheriff tried to hang him before a riot broke out at the hanging, resulting in Hosea being saved by the mob, and the sheriff was eventually then hanged after they believed that he was trying to give Hosea an unfair punishment, and eventually he did meet Dutch when they tried to rob each other a couple years down the line, and then they joined and started their own Van der Linde gang. Arthur Morgan. When Arthur was young, his mother passed away, and his father died after being arrested and hanged in front of his son, and it's implied that Arthur's father did some at least weird things like beating him and like maybe some other forms of abuse, and just wasn't a good father in his own way. But Arthur does still have some fond memories of Lyle Morgan, his father, keeping his hat and a photo, but likely this is just like a way to connect back to his family and his life before the gang. But in 1877, Arthur was found by Dutch and Hosea on the streets, and since he was an orphan, they kind of welcomed him into their gang, and he immediately grew close to them as they acted like his father figures, and Arthur began to embrace Dutch's ideals of a world without rules. And it seems like that was a common theme with Dutch, where he took people that were really on the downtrodden, and he told them about this crazy world where there would be no rules, and he kind of tricked them in that way and like indoctrinated him into the Van der Linde gang cult, and that's how he kind of got them all to follow this ideal of like freedom and anarchism. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. If you do want to see some more Red Dead 2 content, there should be some popping up right now. Click on it.